Your body is teeming with tens of trillions of microbes. It's an entire world, a colony full of life. In other words, according to Ed Yong, you contain multitudes. So this wasn't my first Ed Yong book, though apparently it is his first book. This is a wow of a debut book, I've got to say. But he was an experienced writer, of a science journalist writer, I believe, when he published it. I listen to this as an audiobook, so I don't have a book to wave around at the screen like I normally would. I always find it a bit more difficult to review a non-fiction book. So I finished this a couple of days ago. I've written a couple of reviews. I've thought about how to present it. It's more difficult with a science fact book than it is with a fiction book, because with a fiction it's basically you liked it or you didn't, you enjoyed the reading experience or you didn't, but essentially it's entirely a subjective experience. With a non-fiction book, yes, there's a subjective experience, and I loved this book. This is a 5 out of 5 for me. But there's also the non-subjective things. There's how well was it written, how well was it researched, all those sorts of things. Was the subject matter interesting and relevant? So you've got the subjective and the non-subjective. So yes, I loved it. I loved it as a kind of hobby scientist. I loved it as someone with a background in zoology. I loved it as a science fiction reader as well, though. It's like, of all the science fiction books out there, the world of microbes and prokaryotes is wilder than anything a science fiction writer can imagine. And many science fiction writers have indeed borrowed from the prokaryotes. It was so cool to have a popular science book bring the excitement of the prokaryotic kingdom, that's Monera, and the teams of bacteria and the specialist types and the different environments they live in, aerobic and anaerobic and marine and aquatic and desert and forearms. It was great to see this come out of the textbooks, which are a bit niche, and into the common reading area. It's like, I'd read textbooks before. I'd read things about prokaryotes and the unicellular and the amazing ones with the little wriggly arms and everything. I knew about them, but there's so many of them living, and there's so many wild and wonderful lifestyles, and it's great to have that excitement brought to a popular science book, so to make it available for everyone. Now, I love the way that Ed Yong made the point that, as well as being an individual human being sitting here and talking, each person is a habitat, a whole ecological system for different societies of bacteria. One fascinating point that he made is that here on your nice dry forearm is one ecology of bacteria. Go to your inner ear, go to your mouth, go to the plaque on your teeth, go to any other part of your body, and it's a whole different ecology worth of bacteria. Humans have been taught to think of bacteria as the bad guys, as the pathogens that bring disease, and that's also true in many examples. But this Ed Yong book gives you a chance to expand your knowledge of microbes, realize that many of them are friendly, many of them are good, and even the ones that are in fact pathogenic are so often due to our own behaviors and our own life choices. And that a bacteria that can be a pathogen one day, like the bacteria that are doubtless walking around your little feet, can be a friendly bacteria another day. So, yes, so much in this book. I'm glad that I had some sort of science basis before I got into it. I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's going to be a slower, slightly more difficult read for someone who has no biology background. I kept wanting to go back and reread bits because there's just so much in it, and I couldn't because it was an audiobook. So I'm not sure this book is a great audiobook for me, though the narration is spectacular. As with my last Ed Yong book, it's perfect, it's enthusiastic, he knows his subject matter, and he seems to be thoroughly enjoying the process of bringing it to you, the listener. So that's good. I think I missed too much from it. It's like with the last Ed Yong book, I listened to that as an audio, but I ended up buying it before I was finished it so I could have a real book and I could go back and reread bits and check bits. And I think in the long term, I'm going to have to do that with I Contain Multitudes as well, because there's just so much. Jung keeps giving you one fascinating story and another insight, evolutionary relationships, prokaryotes and eukaryotes becoming symbionts. It's just so much. Also, fun fact that's always been a favorite of mine is that the energy that's supplied in our cell comes from mitochondria. Mitochondria almost certainly used to be bacteria and they became part of our own cells. And that's hence the mitochondrial DNA that some of you may have heard about in some science writing. As a human, you get 50% of your human DNA from your mother and 50% from your father, but 100% of it of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother's line. So you can trace the mother's line through mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondria used to be bacteria until they become part of us. Wonderful story. There was one great story that I really enjoyed. There was a good introduction to the father of microbiology, Antoine van Leeuwenhoek. I think I'm pronouncing that possibly maybe right, almost. He lived between 1632 and 1723. He was one of the first people to observe microorganisms, and he used microscopes of his own design, so he ground his own lens. And I'd heard of this man before and his feats, but Ed Yong made him came alive with his remarkable story. And he was one of the ones that coined the name Animalcula, I believe, when he presented a paper about all these amazing things he saw in basic fresh water, little bacteria with a long flagellum beating it in the water to move through the water. Anyway, great story. You need to read it for yourself. So in other sections we learn about the coevolution of microbes and other animals, including ourselves. I don't remember Young mentioning mitochondria specifically, but I'm sure it came into there somewhere. There's wonderful stories about research relating to specific microbes, and there's so many I can't even start to mention all my favourites. But I will mention Wolbachia. So Wolbachia is a bacteria that has been known for a long time throughout most insects. I think something like 80% of insects have Wolbachia. It's a very, very widespread bacteria in insects. Wolbachia does some pretty horrible things to some insects. It can make some of them sterile. It can make them reproduce pathogenically only, so only the females can reproduce. It can make the male sterile. It does heaps of stuff in heaps of different species, and it's really interesting. Now, in the late 90s, an initiative was started to end dengue fever. And the way that they ended up doing that was infecting laboratory-bred strains of Aedes aegypti, that's the mosquito that spreads dengue and Ross River and Burma forest and Zika and a whole heap of other ones. They bred them to have Wolbachia. The Wolbachia was used to reduce the ability of these mosquitoes to infect humans, because Wolbachia was actually in competition with the parasites the virus of dengue and Ross River. And this is huge. I had dengue when I lived in North Queensland. Maybe it was Ross River virus, and probably it was both. Anyway, it was horrible. It's infects so many people, and it's got long-lasting effects on your health. And in parts of the less developed than Australia world, it is an absolute scourge. It wrecks people. Also, this particular story about the Wolbachia and the Aedes aegypti mosquito were extra special for me because the release program describes the release in Yorkeys Knob, which is a suburb of Cairns I used to live in. I just loved it. It felt personal. It felt a me story. And there's so many other ones. There were stories about FMTs, which I'm not even going to go into because Ed Yong does it so much better, but that relates to people with ulcerative colitis and other similar diseases. There's the probiotic stories. Again, if you're curious, read this book. You should read this book. It's brilliant. Anyway, corals and zooxanthellae get a look in as a symbiotic relationship, as always. Just so much. There's just so much. And the writing is so brilliant. It's exuberant and exciting. And the author's own fascination and excitement, which you must have to have worked this hard on a book to get so much information from so many different sources. It's really, really excellent. And that enthusiasm comes through and he shares it with his readers or his listeners, whatever. The volume of research is completely formidable. All the way around the world, all these different insects and organisms, and there's the history and there's the current researchers. It's just awe-inspiring. I think also that this is one of the exceptions, and for me it's a rare exception, where having the person who wrote the book be a journalist absolutely was an advantage. There are many popular science-ish type books written by journalists, and I'm going to point the finger here, mostly American journalists, who I am terribly unhappy with. They embrace the cult of the writer. They tell you all about what they had for breakfast and all about their personal squeamishness. I don't care. I want the topic that you promised in the book. And Ed Yong never ever falls into this fatal chasm that so many journalists fall into when they try to write a non-fiction book. He manages to make his journey and his experiences personal enough that we feel that we get to know him. He manages to make the personal characters and journeys of the different scientists that he discusses their projects with even more exciting. It's amazing, it's engrossing, it's delightful. It's an incredibly accessible way to learn about our own personal biome and the ecology of the planet, because the ecology of the planet without microbes wouldn't be what it is today. And I feel that they're too often ignored. They're hard to observe, and people have been taught to think of them as disease bringers, so people don't think about that. I had one lecturer in microbiology, it was a marine microbiology subject, who could get passionate dancing around the lecture theatre talking about how you could use microbes to make Mars a habitable program. Now that has been used in science fiction any number of times. But if you want to be a science fiction writer and you want to concentrate on biology, buy this book, read it, and by the end of it you've got more science fiction style stories than you could write in a lifetime. And if you're interested in popular science, buy this book. Read it, listen to it, enjoy it. It's one of Ed Yong in general. I think he's one of the better popular scientist authors that I've come across in the last half dozen years, maybe the last 10 years. There's a few that are truly outstanding. Hats off to Ed Yong. He is one of the truly outstanding ones. And this book is one of the truly outstanding ones. If you're not personally into the prokaryotes, into the bacteria, read this. You will never look at the world the same way again. So yes, read good books. This is a good book. I think you should read it. But if you're not this one, another one. And if you have read it already, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So leave a comment.